The year was 1902, in the quiet parish of Dunley Hollow, a forgotten English village pressed between fog-soaked moors and the grey stretch of the River Severn. On an overcast March morning, a funeral procession gathered at the edge of St. Bartholomew's churchyard. The ground was slick with rain, cobblestones gleaming like wet glass beneath the mourners' boots. Women in heavy black veils clutched handkerchiefs that had long gone cold with tears. The air smelled of damp wool, wilted lilies, and freshly turned earth. At the centre of this still tableau stood a coffin, modest pine, polished to a dull shine, and beside it a man whose presence did not quite belong. His face, sharp and expressionless, seemed caught between sorrow and something far colder. The photograph that captured this moment should have been nothing more than a keepsake of grief. Yet decades later, when it resurfaced in a private archive, it drew the attention of historians for one chilling reason. The man beside the coffin was not listed among the mourners, nor among the living records of the village. When experts enlarged the image, the details grew stranger. His collar bore a faint stain the color of rust. His gaze, misaligned from the others, fixed directly on the camera, as though he had been waiting for this picture to be taken. And that's when investigators realized the murderer had stood quietly beside his victim, immortalized forever in the frame. In the spring of 1902, the small Yorkshire village of Ashcombe Hollow lay wrapped in fog, its cottages clustered like secrets along a single winding road. Life moved at the rhythm of the church bell, births, marriages, and deaths punctuating the quiet days of labor and faith. In that era, death was not hidden away. It was confronted, ritualized, even photographed. The Victorian custom of mourning portraits still lingered. Families would pose solemnly beside the still forms of their loved ones, eyes glassy with grief, hearts frozen like the shutter that captured them. To remember was to hold on, to defy the silence that followed loss. It was during one such ritual that the name Henry Wainwright was spoken in hushed tones. Henry was a respected merchant, known for his generosity and his careful ledgers, the kind of man whose word carried weight in a town that thrived on reputation. His sudden death, heart failure, the doctor said, struck Ashcombe Hollow like a cold wind. On the morning of his funeral, the photographer from Leeds arrived with his wooden tripod and black cloth, ready to immortalize the Wainwright family's grief. Among those gathered stood Arthur Bell, Henry's longtime neighbor and quiet friend. Arthur was known for his manners, his reserved speech, and his near-constant presence at the Wainwright home during the merchant's illness. To the villagers he seemed the embodiment of loyalty, but beneath the lace and laments of that grey morning, a superstition lingered, that a camera could trap more than an image, that it might reveal the truth a living eye could not see. No one then could have imagined that a single photograph from that day would outlast them all, and one day expose a secret buried deeper than Henry's grave. It was in the autumn of 1978 when the photograph surfaced again, a century after it was taken. A small private auction in Leeds offered a collection of mourning portraits, remnants of families long gone, their names fading into dust. Among the faded carte de visite and funeral images was one unmarked photograph, a funeral gathering dated 1902, taken in the Yorkshire village of Elverton Hollow. It showed a simple pine coffin, surrounded by somber faces dressed in black. But it wasn't the deceased who drew attention, it was one living man. The historian who purchased the collection, Dr. Evelyn Marsh, specialized in Victorian mourning customs. She noticed something immediately unsettling. While every mourner faced the coffin, their eyes lowered. One figure, standing slightly apart near the right edge of the frame, was turned toward the camera. His body angled awkwardly, as if caught between two worlds. His name, written faintly on the back in ink, was Arthur Bell. The photograph's technical details deepened the unease. The light came through a narrow window, creating sharp contrasts. Coffin in brightness, mourners in shadow. Arthur Bell's face was half lit, half lost in darkness, and yet his eyes seemed unnaturally sharp. Victorian cameras required exposure times of several seconds. Even the slightest movement would blur the image. But Arthur's gaze was fixed, piercing, alive, almost as if he wasn't posing at all, but watching. When Dr. Marsh magnified the image under a loupe, she noticed something stranger still, the faintest outline of a hand resting on the coffin's edge, a hand that didn't seem to belong to anyone present. It was pale, rigid and blurred, as though it appeared for only part of the exposure. Curious, she traced the photograph back to Henry Wainwright's burial records. The death certificate stated, "Natural causes, heart failure." Yet parish notes from the same week mentioned bruising and a delay in burial due to unusual discoloration. The undertaker's ledger, preserved in local archives, recorded something more cryptic: marks inconsistent with peaceful death. And so the question emerged: if the death had truly been natural, why did Arthur Bell look directly at the camera, breaking the unspoken etiquette of mourning photography? And why did he never appear in any other photograph again? In the official records, Henry Wainwright's death was described as a sudden failure of the heart brought on by exhaustion. Nothing more. No mention of pain, no evidence of a struggle, just a quiet ending to a man whose life by all accounts was ordinary. But those who had known Henry in the days before his passing remembered something different. He had been seen walking briskly to his shop, sharing laughter with his apprentices, and dining heartily at the village inn. There had been no sign of fatigue, no hint of illness. In a place like Yorkshire in 1902, whispers carried faster than the wind. And soon whispers began to spread. Some said Henry had been burdened by debts, a rumor that gained weight when the local notary confirmed unpaid accounts. Among the names mentioned was Arthur Bell, a man who had lent money to Henry for the expansion of his small mercantile business. The two men had argued quietly at first, then with growing bitterness behind closed doors. Yet when Henry was found dead in his bed on a cold January morning, it was Arthur who appeared most devoted. He was the first to arrive, the first to offer comfort to the widow, the first to suggest that the doctor be called. The village physician, Dr. Collingwood, examined the body briefly, and after a few cursory notes signed the death certificate. In those days, such signatures carried weight. A man's word was evidence enough. No autopsy, no inquiry, just the heavy seal of official acceptance. Victorian England ran on quiet hierarchies. The wealthy were protected by their image, and the truth often bent beneath it. Henry had been a man of standing. His sudden death was treated not with suspicion, but with respect. And Arthur, ever courteous, ever composed, remained by the family's side, a symbol of friendship in grief. But some villagers could not forget the faint trace of unease in his manner, the way his eyes lingered on the coffin, the silence that followed whenever his name was mentioned. The world moved on as it always did. Only the photograph remained, but the photograph, it seemed, had captured something the witnesses had not. When the photograph resurfaced in 1978, it drew only mild interest at first. It was catalogued among dozens of other early mourning portraits, sold as part of a private estate, belonging to a late collector of Victorian ephemera. But one buyer, a university historian named Dr. Eleanor Marsh, saw something others had missed. She specialized in the psychology of early portraiture, how expressions could reveal truths the subjects never intended to show. She described the image as unsettling in composition. The coffin, draped in black cloth, rested slightly off-center, while the mourners formed a crescent around it. At first glance, it seemed like any other village funeral, sorrowful, restrained, formal. But on closer examination, one figure broke the harmony. A man stood at the far left, his shoulders angled away from the rest, his eyes locked directly on the lens. His expression was not grief nor solemnity. It was something colder, detached, calculating. Dr. Marsh noted that early cameras required long exposure times, often 10 to 15 seconds, meaning each subject had to remain perfectly still. Any flicker of emotion, any involuntary movement became etched into permanence. Yet the man's face, even frozen in time, appeared alive in a way the others did not. His gaze seemed to follow the viewer, unyielding. Even centuries later, intrigued, Dr. Marsh compared the image with parish death records and found the name Henry Wainwright listed for the date of the funeral. The certificate declared natural causes, but another note caught her attention, a witness signature belonging to Arthur Bell, the same name later identified by descendants as the man in the photograph. What unsettled her most wasn't just his presence, but the alignment of the light itself. The shadow from the coffin stretched in one direction. Yet the shadow from Arthur Bell's shoes pointed slightly elsewhere, as if his figure had been caught at a moment of subtle movement, something rare and nearly impossible for that photographic process. Experts debated whether it was a flaw in development or evidence of something else, something human, momentary and out of place, and as one analyst remarked quietly during examination, it's as if he didn't belong in that picture at all. By the early 1980s, advancements in forensic imaging allowed experts to re-examine historical photographs in unprecedented detail. Dr. Marsh, driven by growing unease, submitted the 1902 funeral photograph to the British Photographic Archive for spectral analysis, a method capable of revealing micro-imprints and texture, distortions invisible to the naked eye. What emerged under magnification startled even the technicians. Near the lower corner of the image, on the polished lid of the coffin, a faint smudge reflected light differently from the rest of the surface. Under enhanced contrast, the mark began to take shape, not random grain but the distinct outline of a human hand. The angle suggested someone had pressed against the coffin's edge moments before exposure. The size and proportion matched a man's left hand, consistent with Arthur Bell's visible stance. This discovery reignited suspicion surrounding Wainwright's death. If the handprint had been there during the photo, it implied proximity and contact with the coffin that witnesses never mentioned. But the real question was why? What could drive a mourner to touch the coffin so intimately just before the shutter clicked? When chemical analysis compared tonal patterns, another anomaly appeared. Beneath the fabric of Wainwright's collar, a faint discoloration, invisible to observers at the time, hinted at bruising or compression. The findings were subtle but consistent with asphyxiation, not illness. The death certificate's claim of heart failure now seemed less like a conclusion and more like a convenient excuse. Dr. Marsh's report was never meant for publication. She feared ridicule, especially from peers who dismissed the study of psychological relics as pseudoscience. Yet her notes revealed something chilling. She believed the photograph had preserved not only faces, but evidence, a frozen confession captured by light. In one margin, she wrote, "This image feels alive, as if the camera recorded a truth the witnesses could not." When the photo was displayed briefly in a small Leeds gallery, visitors reported the same uneasy reaction, that Arthur Bell's eyes seemed to follow them wherever they stood. Some even swore his expression shifted under dim light. It was no longer just a photograph, it was evidence hiding in plain sight for 76 years. Arthur Bell had always been described as ordinary, a quiet clerk at the local trading office, punctual, reserved, polite to the point of invisibility. Yet in every small town, invisibility often hides the deepest resentments. Through census records and estate ledgers, Dr. Marsh traced a fragile connection between Bell and the deceased merchant, Henry Wainwright. Wainwright had been more than just a respected trader. He was a lender, the kind who offered small loans to struggling townsfolk when banks refused them. Arthur Bell was among those indebted. In 1901, records showed Bell's wages garnished after a failed repayment. Though the amount was modest, gossip from surviving letters painted a humiliating picture. Bell's pride had been publicly wounded. Wainwright, in a fit of irritation, had reportedly called him a man born to servitude during a dispute overheard at the market. In the rigid hierarchy of Edwardian England, such words carried a sting that never faded. Further evidence came from a diary fragment belonging to Wainwright's widow, discovered decades later in a family trunk. One entry, dated just 2 days before the merchant's death, read, "Arthur came to the house again. His eyes troubled me. Henry says the debt will be settled soon, but there is unease in his voice." Then silence. 2 days later, Henry was found unresponsive at his writing desk, his hand still gripping a pen. The doctor, a family friend, pronounced heart failure within the hour. No investigation followed, but Dr. Marsh uncovered something stranger still, a small insurance document, filed the day before the death, transferring part ownership of a warehouse property to Arthur Bell as collateral. The transaction bore both men's signatures, but handwriting experts later noticed inconsistencies. The Henry signature on the form appeared unusually stiff, lacking his usual flourish. As though written under duress, the pieces began to form a darker picture. Humiliation, debt, desperation. What had once seemed a story of illness was revealing itself as an act of quiet vengeance, one planned carefully, executed without witnesses and buried beneath social courtesy. Yet the most haunting truth was not the motive itself, but the question it left behind. Did Arthur Bell feel remorse as he stood beside the coffin? Or triumph? In the end, the 1902 photograph became more than a record of mourning. It became a confession carved in light. What began as an image meant to preserve grief had unknowingly preserved guilt. Every shadow, every still expression, whispered a truth that no one in that village ever dared to speak aloud. Arthur Bell's face, once lost in history, now stares back across more than a century, unblinking. And Henry Wainwright's coffin, caught forever in that faded frame, stands as a silent witness to the price of pride and secrecy. Perhaps that is the curse of early photography. It never truly forgets. So one can't help but wonder, how many old portraits hanging quietly in attics and archives still hide their own secrets, waiting for someone to look close enough?